Schempp Shindig. I do have one job as your development director, to remind anybody here who's not an official member of the UUA Humanist Association, which I can now use that name, thank you very much. I don't have to redo all those banners and brochures that I did, thank you. Please see the lovely lady in the hat at the table over there. Pat will be happy to make you an official member of the organization if you're not already, because we want to keep doing fun things like this. All right, so we're going to briefly hear from two of Ellery's friends and associates who are going to talk about Ellery. Then we're going to hear from Ellery himself. And then immediately we're going to break for more snacks, the open bar will be there, and we're going to have a fun jazz duo. We're made up of John Dreyer and Harvey who are already in the house. So as soon as we're done with the talking part, we're just going to have some jazz music, have fun, and shindig until about 9 o'clock. So, it's my distinct pleasure to first introduce Mr. David Niose. David is an attorney, an author, and an activist who has served as the president of two Washington-based national secular organizations, the American Humanist Association and the Secular Coalition for America. The American Humanist Association promotes humanism and defends the rights of humanists and other non-theistic Americans, and the Secular Coalition for America is a lobbying and advocacy organization for non-theistic Americans. Currently, he is the legal director of AHA's Abington Humanist Legal Center. So I give you David Niose.
Thank you, Maria. Maria asked me to say a few words about the Abington School District v. Schempp case from a legal perspective, I guess, and I want to do that. But before I do that, Ellery, I just wanted to thank you for all you've done helping me in my activism in this community, and I know for a fact helping so many other people in the humanist community in New England and nationwide. I've seen all that you've done and all that you put into your work and your life promoting humanism and church-state separation, and I just want to thank you very, very much. When I first got involved in humanist activism about 9 years ago, Ellery was one of the first activists that I met in the community. He lives not too far from me, and somebody said, you got to meet this guy, Ellery Schempp. So it wasn't too long that I did meet Ellery, and I knew before meeting him that, of course, he was the plaintiff in this very important Supreme Court case, and I figured he'd have an interesting story. But what I really wasn't braced for was just the energy and enthusiasm that Ellery brings to his activism and his entire life, quite frankly. I see him at a lot of events. Just a few days ago, I saw him at an event in a church, of all places, for two humanists to me. And he was sitting in a pew, and behind him were a couple high school students. And he was turned around in his pew talking to them, and they were leaning forward, talking to him, just engaged, talking about current events and all sorts of important issues. And it's just great to see that kind of enthusiasm. And I know he's passing it on to the next generation. So thanks. But anyway, from a legal perspective, Abington School District versus Schempp, let me just say a couple of things. But one thing that I thought of that I bet you've probably never thought of in this exact way is that it's probably true that every single lawyer in the United States has heard of Ellery Schempp. How can that be? Well, every lawyer, of course, goes to law school, and everyone who goes to law school has to take constitutional law. And if you take constitutional law, you have to study the First Amendment, and you can't study the First Amendment without learning about the Establishment Clause. And if you learn about the Establishment Clause, there are several names that you just have to know. You have to know Everson, you have to know McCollum, you have to know Engel, and you have to know Schempp. The Schempp case is a seminal case in church-state separation in constitutional law. Certainly one of the most important cases of the 20th century in that area. And what's really important about it, there are many, many things we could go on and on about it, but I think when you really boil it down, the Schempp case in many ways reflects the Warren Court's willingness to move America into the modern era, to really push for America to be a pluralistic, inclusive, and secular society. And we know that many people in America really aren't too gung-ho about those particular values, but the Warren Court very much was. And the Warren Court used the Schempp case to push in that exact direction. The Warren Court recognized that reading Bible verses in a devotional way each morning is not something that everyone agrees on in America. Perhaps in the 18th or 19th century, there was virtual unanimity on reading the Bible. I would never say there was complete unanimity, but maybe there was something close to it at one point in time. But certainly by the late 20th century, America was not the kind of nation that that was appropriate for. The Warren Court recognized that. Compare that to the values of many jurists today who think that we should still go back to 18th century standards in interpreting the Establishment Clause. Very much different during the 1960s when the Schempp case came down. I call the era, and many people do, the heyday of church-state separation, and I think that's, anyone who looks at it would have to conclude that. It was during the Kennedy presidency that the Schempp case came down. John F. Kennedy, as we all know, ran for president saying that he believed in absolute separation of church and state. Can you imagine even a Democrat today running saying that? It's just a completely different environment. Unfortunately, we didn't continue to move in the direction that Schempp and the Warren Court brought us. Just some of the language from the Schempp case, let me read for you. It's for some language that we would love to see in cases today, but unfortunately we don't. Justice Tom Clark wrote the opinion. It was an 8-to-1 opinion. And I'll quote, "The ideal of our people as to religious freedom is one of absolute equality before the law of all religious opinions and sects." Another quote is that government cannot pass laws or impose requirements which aid all religions against non-believers or aid those religions based on a belief in the existence of God against those religions founded on different beliefs. So we have here, 50 years ago, a very enlightened court, thanks to a young, rabble-rousing kid who sent a letter to the ACLU saying, hey, this ain't right, what they're doing in my school. And thank goodness he did. One more thing I'll point out about the Abington case is just as important as Justice Tom Clark's majority opinion is Justice Brennan's concurrence. And it's very relevant today. Justice Brennan was relatively young then. He had only been on the bench for a few years. And he wrote for 76 pages in his concurrence agreeing with the ruling. And the real point that he wanted to make is the importance of not applying 18th century standards to 20th century America. It was a response to the claim from the other side that since Bibles were used in schools back in the 18th and 19th century, then of course we have to continue to use them today. That's the same logic that we saw in the Town of Priest case with legislative prayer. Well, since they did it back in the founding era, we do it now. Well, not necessarily, right? Times change, society changes, and the Warren Court, especially Justice Brennan, realized that. He had thoughts on seeking the intent of the founders, and he said, quite frankly, a too literal quest for the advice of the founding fathers seems to me futile and misdirected. We can't know what they would think today, and American society has changed greatly. I'll point out that at the time of the founding, America was not only 98% Christian, it was 98% Protestant. So it was a very homogeneous society. And the very enlightened Warren Court recognized that. I wish I could stand here today and say that the modern court is just as enlightened, but I think we all know that's not the case. But anyway, Ellery, thank you very much for giving us this very important precedence, and I'm going to turn it back over to Maria.
Thanks, David. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Ron Madnick. Ron is the current president of the Massachusetts chapter of Americans United, a separation of church and state, and he's a trustee of Americans United. Ron is the executive director of the Worcester County chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, and he serves on boards of numerous civil rights organizations, including Massachusetts Citizens Against the Death Penalty. Ron reaches the public through his show, Civil Liberties with Ron Madnick, Know Your Rights, on TV 13, Worcester Public Access Television. So here's Ron.
In 1996, when we began the Massachusetts chapter of Americans United, the separation of church and state, we thought we would give a religious liberty award. So I asked the board, who should we give it to? And someone said, Ellery Schempp. Now, I'm not a lawyer. Frankly, I never had heard of Ellery Schempp. So I began to do some research on Ellery Schempp. And I found out three things that were very interesting. I found out he's a noted physicist. I found out he had climbed some of the highest mountains in the world. And I also found out he was the man responsible for stopping me from reading the Bible at Chandler Street Junior High School. And I resent that very much. And let me tell you why. When I began in 1960, I was told I had to read the Bible. And I thought that was wonderful. I thought I would teach for 40 years, and by the time I was done, I would have read the whole Bible on the taxpayers' time and be paid for doing it. And I thought that was wonderful. I was not sensitive to some of the issues I am today. Then all of a sudden, in 1963, I was told to stop. And like every good teacher back in those days, we did what we were told, and of course we trust the government. And so I stopped reading at that time, and I never did finish reading the Bible, and that's all because of that man over there. And then what happened is in 2013, I had the honor of introducing Ellery at our national meeting of Americans United, the separation of church and state, in Washington, D.C. And here we are today in 2014. It's very appropriate that we be here at a Unitarian Universalist Assembly, since Ellery's family also belonged to that as well. Now, when I first heard about Ellery, I thought to myself, what did he really do? Well, first of all, it's very unusual in 1958 for anyone being concerned about these issues. It wasn't like today. I thought, well, maybe he refused to read from the Bible because he was supposed to. Maybe he made a speech in the classroom to the teacher. He was probably sent to the principal. So I did teach for 34 years. And then I figured they probably called his parents. And, you know, they thought the parents were going to certainly say, oh, yeah, by all means, give attention to after school and so on and so forth. They didn't know that his parents were Unitarian Universalists. And of course, they supported their son 100%, as did other members of the family. So eventually the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and legal matters tend usually, David, to move very slowly. And 5 years later, the Supreme Court ruled on this case at that particular time. It's also fitting that we're here in Providence, Rhode Island. And the history of Roger Williams, as you know, was thrown out of Massachusetts. He escaped just before they put him on a ship to bring him back to England because he believed in separation of church and state. This is very appropriate that we're here today. Now, Ellery has spoken all over the country to American civil liberties, humanists, Unitarians, and many, many others And he shows the same enthusiasm today that I think he probably did when he was 16 years old. Now, what did he really do in that classroom in 1958? He brought in the Quran. Now, I doubt that he was probably the only student in the room who even knew what the Quran was. And I even questioned whether the teacher knew what it was. And he made his point that there are other religious books besides the King James Version of the Bible. So that's what happened there. Now, Ellery has never stopped. Last year, he testified before the Joint Committee of the State Legislature in Massachusetts. What was that all about? It was a bill to introduce the Bible and other religious writings as compulsory course in the public schools of Massachusetts. And Ellery testified on that. And of course, he gave all the reasons, why it was not a good idea. And one of the things he did say, as he did 50 years ago last year, is, which Bible? And he read a whole bunch of them. And of course, what happened, the item was filed. So the issue comes up from time to time, and we know we can always call on Ellery to be there to fight that ludicrous idea. Now, if the rest of the world had accepted the message that Ellery was given, we'd be living today in a much more peaceful planet. So I hope this message that he's been getting out, not just in the United States, I hope it spreads around the globe. And it starts the idea that religion is best when it's separate, and government is best when it is separate, and it is worse when they mix with each other. And I just have to mention two words, the Middle East. So I want to thank Ellery for being a leader. I doubt any other student would have done that back in 1958, would have the courage to do it, even had the thought to do it. So again, thank you for leading the way to many things that came thereafter. To make this, I think, the freest country in the world when it comes to religion. And I believe we have one of the highest attendance in churches today of any country in the world. And so it shows that separation of church and state is a good idea for the church, it's a good idea for the government. Thank you, Ellery.
Okay, the very last person we hear from before we hear from Ellery himself is the Reverend John Gibbons. He's the minister of the First Parish in Bedford, Massachusetts, which was named a breakthrough congregation by the UUA in 2012. And John also has the deep honor of being Ellery Schempp's minister. So here's John Gibbons.
Hi, everybody. Fortunately, Ellery has himself written a biographical sketch with short, medium, and narrative versions. This is the short, basic version. Schempp was born. He is not dead yet. He supports humanists. But then he goes on. Since my life has not been a linear path from A to R, not yet to Z, and I have a pied-à-terre in the scientific, mountaineering, social, political, and religious domains, it is not so easy to make a short account. So here is a little more. After Abington High School, Ellery attended Tufts, where he received his Bachelor of Science, cum laude in physics. He then attended Brown here in Providence, where he received his PhD in physics for research into chemical bonding in nitrogen-containing molecules. The thesis itself was titled Nuclear Quadrupole Resonance in Nitrogen Heterocycles. You can feel free to ask him what that is all about. He has been a professor, a researcher, an authority on nuclear waste disposal and energy efficiency, a contributor to magnetic resonance imaging technology, and trust me, lots more. At Tufts, he acquired a lifelong love for exploring and adventuring in the natural world, not the supernatural world. He had summer jobs in Greenland and the Canadian Arctic, and also with Tufts, he joined an expedition to Antarctica in 1960, studying the geomorphology of glacial events, about 800 miles from the South Pole. Hiking and climbing across the world, in 1977, he was a member of an expedition to Nanga Parbat in Pakistan, the 9th highest peak in the world. Tragically, 2 of his colleagues were killed in that expedition when part of the mountain collapsed. Not knowing their fate, Ellery volunteered to cross an ice field, whereupon he careened down the slope, severely breaking his ankle. There are many details to this episode, but Ellery also recalls that one of his Sherpa rescuers was a descendant of Alexander the Great. There is one culinary note to this introduction. Mountain climbers need a lot of calories, and Ellery developed a taste for crater crunchies, made with a thick cracker, a layer of cheese, a layer of peanut butter, molded into a crater that was then filled with jam and eaten in one bite. 500 calories. In the domains of Ellery's passions, social, mountaineering, scientific, political, and religious, Ellery especially acknowledges 2 things. Those who came before him and in whose footsteps he and we now walk. And Ellery also emphasizes that nothing is ever accomplished alone. Scientific advancement, mountaineering, and social change, none are solo acts. All are team efforts. While not diminishing his personal role in the cause of civil liberties, Ellery honors the framers of the Constitution and the authors of the Bill of Rights. As for other pioneers, among many others, Ellery recalls Sir Robert Falcon Scott, who pioneered Antarctic expeditions and in so doing lost his life. Ellery also honors Madeline Murray O'Hare, another kind of martyr. The Supreme Court case would not have happened without Ellery, and yet always he honors his own parents and his family for their courage and their encouragement. And Ellery also acknowledges the importance of his current partnership with Arlene Germain, that is, if he knows what's good for him. In addition to individuals, Ellery further acknowledges the institutions that inspired and supported his family's struggles. The Unitarian Church of his youth and the ACLU. He tells others to affiliate with those organizations that embody our values, because really, that's the only way that things get done. We in Bedford, Massachusetts, and Bedford, why don't you have a shout out here for Ellery? We in Bedford, Massachusetts are so proud that Ellery has cast his lot with us. He preaches, he teaches, and he is a cashier at our annual plant fair. Again, this is not all about Ellery. brought other great humanists to our church as well. Tom Farrick, David Niose, Mike Newdow, Barry Lynn. Concerned for the future of the causes he has championed, Ellery pays particular attention to young people. Once he challenged our First Parish youth to name the 6 protections that are part of the First Amendment. Freedom of speech and press, freedom of religion, freedom from the establishment of religion, the right to assemble, and the right to petition the government to redress grievances. We gave facsimile parchment constitutions to kids who could name all of them, and the first to respond received a personal home visit from Ellery and specially engraved pens. We also teach a class for teenagers we call X-rated civics. We try to do for civil liberties what OWL has done for human sexuality education, and Ellery is always the first to testify. For your willingness and courage to take on so many physical, scientific, moral, and political challenges, for your humanist example, we honor you, Ellery. You are a model to Unitarian Universalists, and we appreciate you. Ellery, I am told that you do not need much coaxing to recite in a foreboding voice the final words of Sir Scott, written in his diary when he knew that his Antarctic expedition was doomed. I have just a little bit more to say, but Ellery, would you come up here and recite those final words for me now?
They're too wonderful for words. In March of 1911, Sir Robert Falcon Scott, an Englishman, had reached the South Pole and found that Amundsen, the Norwegian, had beaten him to be the first man to the South Pole. He died. Scott died on his way back with his four companions, only 11 miles from a food depot that would have allowed them to survive. In March of 1911, so Scott was a failure. But he kept a marvelous diary, and I urge you all to read it. And his last words were these: "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, courage, and endurance of my companions that would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. But these rough notes and our dead bodies must tell that tale."
Ellery, we are so glad that you're not dead yet, nor are you doomed. We are glad that you're still full of spunk and tenacity, intellect and humor, hardiness, endurance, and faithfulness. With your still live body, we want you now to tell your tale.
I'm also very pleased that I'm not dead yet. Well, it's just overwhelmingly wonderful to have these affirmations from so many of my respected friends and good friends and our friends at UUA Bedford and the humanists, and it's just, I don't know, get very tearful about all this stuff. That was quite an introduction. I would like to point out that it's unfortunate, in my view, that Supreme Court cases are known like Abington versus Schempp and Murray versus Gerber, and Engel versus Victoria. In our particular case, our lawyer was named Henry W. Sawyer. The case should have been known as Henry Sawyer, or Sawyer versus much known. Sawyer also went on to argue the Lemon case that became successfully, and the Lemon case is an extremely important one in the history of the Supreme Court separation of church and state jurisprudence. So I think if anybody is to be honored for this case, it's Henry Sawyer. He was the attorney for, he served pro bono at the request of the ACLU. He was from River Middleton and Roth in Philadelphia, one of those Philadelphia lawyer types. Okay. I'd also like to make a little mention. You know, the case is known as Abington versus Schempp. Well, the Schempp, of course, is my parents. My father's name was Schempp, of course. And my name is actually not in the Supreme Court decision at all. And there's a reason for that. Because I had graduated from high school and moved on to college, and so the law that we were protesting in Pennsylvania no longer applied to me. That is to say, the case was moot as regards to me. And if it had not been for the fact that I had a younger brother, Roger, and a younger sister, Donna, who were still in school at that time, then the case would have been thrown out by the courts and never adjudicated. So there's a lot of little bits of, I don't know, good luck, I suppose, that has to contribute to all these things. Well, you know, I've always advocated that we should have memorial services before we die. And it's amazing how much we are loved, and we can enjoy and hear this before we die. So I thank you very much for this particular opportunity. I do appreciate John Gibbons for welcoming me to his church. You know, in Bedford, Reverend. Well, then you have worship services, and then you have hymns, and pretty soon you have religion. It keeps up on it. But I'm going to talk about why we have to bring in humanism and even atheists into our church. And why am I a member of a Unitarian church in the first place? Well, when I moved here from California, I was lonely and casting around for a community, and many of the surrounding congregations all ignored me. In Lexington, Bedford, Belmont, Cambridge. But John Gibbons at the UU Bedford was warm and welcomed me in 2003. I do remember that summer when I joined the UU church. Humanists and atheists did not talk about providing community back then. Humanists don't even have hymns and choirs. So where would a non-theist go? Well, in conversations with my friend Greg Epstein, the humanist chaplain at Harvard, on this very subject. I'm happy to be in the company of skeptics, heretics, apostatizers, non-believers. I hope none of you are blasphemers. That would be going too far. But before we go on, may I suggest, let us pray. Well, maybe not. I hear some nervous giggles, but isn't that an evocative phrase? Almost instinctively, we respond, like picking up a kitten or a puppy by the scruff of the neck. It makes us compliant and content. Now, what we pray for, that's another different subject. I never tried out for a beauty pageant, so I never had to pray for world peace. I've been privileged to receive several awards. I think it a bit odd, because the only thing I really achieved was to get the ACLU and my family involved way back in 1956, 57, and 58. I haven't done so much to deserve awards. It turns out that if you live to be 73 years old, you did something in high school that gets remembered. Well, there's some things I did in high school that I hope are not remembered. I do have a little claim to fame. I was once announced publicly by Ted Cruz. As I mentioned, awards mean to me remembering on behalf of my father and mother, Edward and Sydney, and my brother Roger and my sister Donna. Without my parents' support, nothing would have happened. Teenagers cannot win court cases, and I would have just been another troubled teenager. Awards go to I can wait for the stampede to the exit. But the family history says I was a cute baby. I guess the demonic, satanic features came later. So I accept awards on behalf of the ACLU and their attorney, Henry Sawyer, as I mentioned. Without the help of the ACLU, there could have been no case. There almost wasn't. The ACLU in Philadelphia had many reservations back in 1956, 1958. This was in the waning days of the McCarthy era. There were many considerations. Well, there's a wonderful book by Steve Sullivan called Ellery Schempp. So I did not write this book, I'm not the author, and I don't get a nickel from selling it, but it's a wonderful description of the whole set of circumstances that led to the Supreme Court case. So I highly recommend it as a very good read. It's very well written. Henry Sawyer was a remarkable man. He worked, I mentioned that Tinkerville well off, and he spent a year researching and thinking and constructing arguments to present the case to the Supreme Court. And he proved to be very skillful in examination and cross-examination. So I accept the awards posthumously for Henry Sawyer. And as I mentioned, it is not plaintiffs that win cases, but it's lawyers that win cases. And I also want to mention that the case in its full glory is known as Abington Township versus Pennsylvania and Murray versus Curl. Well, the tree of knowledge business has always concerned me, and I've enjoyed exploring, as John said. And I studied physics because I was interested in the glue we call chemical bonds. So my research was in chemical physics. I also did a good bit in geology. I had the good fortune of having spent a couple summers in Greenland and in the Arctic, 400 miles from the North Pole, and then in the South Pole. John forced me to recite the story about the Sir Robert Falcon Scott, who perished in March of 1911, and I said, "Had you lived?" And there was another paragraph. For myself, I do not regret this journey, which has shown that Englishmen can endure hardship and meet death with as great a fortitude as ever in the past. Well, I'm happy to be back here in Providence. I was actually here for 6 years while I was in Brown, where I did fee and student visits. Providence has a lot that is worth discovering. It's at the end of the Blackstone River Valley, one of the birthplaces of the Industrial Revolution. It's also the home of H.P. Lovecraft, who may have invented zombies. His former home is just up the hill here on Angel and Waterman Streets. John did forget to mention my homelessness. I'm really surprised that so many people at UU Bedford recognize me. There may be 300 or so people in the congregation, and I know only maybe 50 or so on a good day. Well, I had a rather bizarre health event a few years ago, which seemed like a stroke at the time, and lots of people rallied around to express good wishes. One emailed me that the headlines would have been "Atheist Dies in Church." I was inspired not to die. Another time, I had a knee replacement surgery, and I was on crutches. I came to our joys and concerns to express my thanks for the many good wishes, and I mentioned that I had made a spiritual discovery. I had taken UUism into my heart, so now I could throw away the crutches and walk again. I raised them above my head and walked back to the pew. Arlene was hiding over the pew by then. There was applause. The tale seems to be remembered in UU Bedford. Well, in 1954, when things were brewing, well, 1956 is when I first made a protest about Bible reading and prayer in the public schools. But in 1950, the period of time, that was right after the Supreme Court had decided that separate but equal in the Brown versus Topeka case was a very important new idea in how we were going to understand being equal in this country in the public schools and in fact, and segregated schools. 1954 was also the time when the Congress, in its great wisdom, actually added the phrase "under God to the pledge." Now, you may remember that the Pledge of never recited by the founding fathers, was never recited by Abraham Lincoln, because it was only written in 1896 by Francis Bellamy, who was a minister with some socialist leanings, and he had not very many deep thoughts about this, and it never became very important until World War I came along, and then suddenly everybody wanted a patriotic thing, and there was the Pledge of Allegiance. And it went along without too much notice after that until World War II, when there was a great deal more chest thumping and a great deal more thinking about some kind of patriotic loyalty oath, and that's how the Pledge of Allegiance came to become well known to all of us. But even then, the Pledge of Allegiance did not contain the phrase "under God." That was only added in 1954 by at the urgings of the Knights of Columbus, and to distinguish us from the godless atheists of our enemies in the Soviet Union. So it's only in 1954 that we had the phrase "under God." Well, I pledge allegiance and to the nation under God and all that. It's very amusing to know that this idea of under God, when the Congress passed it, the entire Congress marched out to the steps of the Congress, of the Capitol, singing "Onward Christian Soldiers." So the notion behind this under God thing is clearly of extremely religious fervency. Also I might mention that in 1954, 55 maybe it was the first edition of Playboy magazine. Now, I have always been very conscious about reading good literature, and I never had very much interest in anything except the articles, but I did think that if there was a conflict between Playboy magazine and the Bible, I thought I should know which side I would come down on. And the Bible lost, I'm sorry to say. You know about original sin, of course, but so much has gone before, so it's impossible to be original. I think you should think about that. Plagiarizing is also a sin. My father, Edward, had many struggles with the conventional religion that he learned as a child in the 1910s and 20s. He was fond of redefining concepts, which is known as apologetics in Christian circles. He said that sin is anything less than the best you can do. Well, that's pretty good. But as my father's son threw all that away and embraced sin, here I am. Dad wanted very much to believe in a God, and he fought Billy Graham and Carl McIntyre. Oh, you don't know, he was a local minister in southern New Jersey who had 9 some radio stations at one time, a huge empire. But my father concluded that there was no God. He was disappointed in this conclusion, but he died as atheist. My mother, Cindy, was never much interested in religion, and I think indifferent as to God. I do recall, as I mentioned before, that I was born just once, and she had no interest in having me growing up. I did mention Murray, that is Madeline Murray, O'Hare. She brought an almost identical case in Maryland about Bible readings and prayers in the Abington case, which was first heard in Federal District Court on August 5th, 1958. I remember that first hearing in the Federal District Court in Philadelphia. I remember it well because it happened to be on my 18th birthday. If some of you have birthdays, I recommend choosing the dates, the court dates to coincide. David mentioned that there was an important case before that, that was known as Engel versus Vitale, had to do with a New York law that suggested that introduced a prayer in the public schools of New York. And it was very innocuous. It said something to the effect of Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon thee, and blah, 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 and ask for blessings from our teachers and ourselves, whatever. And that prayer, that law, was ruled unconstitutional in 1962. That was 1 year before the separation of church and state. What is the business of government? And I think that every time before there's this council meeting, we should know that the business of government is not about prayers, it's about fixing the roads, it's about having the taxes to fix the city hall, to repaint whatever, and that's the business of government, it's not prayer. Well, after the Abington decision, of course, there are other important decisions, like Griswold in 1965. Griswold was the important decision that had to do with legalizing, requiring that birth control be left up to individual people, contraception. Now, I remember that the Rhode Island turns out to be the most Catholic state in the entire country in terms of percentage of population. Connecticut is also quite highly Catholic. Massachusetts was then too. And those three states went together at the behest of the church authorities to outlaw contraception in every form. In Massachusetts, I'm not sure you're in Rhode Island, Massachusetts even went so far as to outlaw having a doctor even discuss or mention the matter to people. But the Griswold case in Connecticut overthrew all those laws, and that was very important for her as a separation of church and state, and recognizing her right to privacy, which also became enshrined in the idea of Roe versus Wade. Well, there are present-day pioneers too, and many things I'm going to cut away a lot of time here, but Jessica Alquist, I see Stephen here, Jessica, right here in Princeton, Rhode Island, objected as a high school student to some kind of prayer banner that had been on the walls of the high school for 30 years or so, but it referenced a deity, and she, as a non-believer and an atheist, that this was improper, and challenged this discussion. Well, I don't know. Matthew LeClaire in New Jersey, Josh Damon in Louisiana, the Secular Student Alliance has done a lot of good things to try to help young people recognize their rights and give them sanctuary and a sense of community in spite of them being non-believers. Well, people have sometimes said that I inspired them. Well, no, I don't think so. Jessica Alquist, prayer banner here in Cranston, Rhode Island High School, for example, was on a paddle with last year that Ron Madnick actually organized, and she suddenly blurted out, I had no idea who you are, and that my court case relied on your case. So it's quite easy to be famous and totally unknown. So I don't think I'm an inspiration. But I do worry about the moral decline. A few weeks ago, we lived close to the Mystic Lakes in Massachusetts, in Medford. And a few weeks ago, I was parked next to a car that had a decal on its back window that said, since Bible reading was taken out of public schools, the nation has been on a trajectory of moral decline. That's pretty long for a bumper sticker, but it's a nice decal. And I thought, it has to be by divine providence that I managed to park next to that particular car in that particular location on that particular day. Well, I want to emphasize that there is not one Bible. There are 20 or more of them. And for something being promoted as the Word of God, it is troublesome that the Catholic Douay Rheims version of the Bible contains several more books than Martin Luther took out because he didn't like them. And the numbers of the commandments in the Catholic version differ from those that we're familiar with in the Protestant version. And then there's the Orthodox Bible, and the Coptic Bible, and then the Jewish Bible, which of course is the Torah and something. This contains the central myth of Judaism, Israeli slaves in Egypt, Moses, and God's interactions with plagues, etc., etc. Well, there is zero historical evidence for Israelites building pyramids in Egypt under a pharaoh. This is a myth. And translations. I do appreciate that English is good enough for Jesus, it is good enough for all of us. And of course, Adam and Eve and Noah's flood are myths of Genesis. I did used to believe believe in talking snakes myself, but then went back and Sarah Palin came along. In my travels, I actually went up to Mount Sinai and climbed to the top. It was a lovely summer day. My friend John Belcher and I spent several hours there with a picnic lunch and a warm sun and some wine. I am extremely disappointed to have to tell you that I never saw any gold towers. So as to ethical or humanist values, you've got to work out these matters for yourself. I mean, I did my best. I'm not sure where the mountain of the flying spaghetti monster is. Now, there's something important about dethroning the Bible. The anti-Gaia folks have shouted again and again and aloud at Leviticus that God abhors gays. It's a quote that you've seen reprinted many times. I always wonder whether when someone says that God speaks to them, of course, any modern God would use email. The right wing never gives out his email address, so that's maybe because he prefers Verizon over Comcast. I'm kind of puzzled about this. Anyhow, God is quoted, it's quite neat phrase, quoted by some believer, that gays should be stunned. Well, we know that several states have legalized marijuana, so I understand we're just catching up. Hooray for Leviticus. One really interesting thing happened. The gay-obsessed sex club got their knickers in a twist for violating the Bible. What happened? People actually departed from the Bible. People started actually believing that gay marriage and love and affection between people was more important than some passages written in an old book from 2,000 years ago. Well, I want to say only one or two things. I would like to honor, well, since we're here in Rhode Island, Roger Williams. It seems that Roger Williams was actually the first person to have invented the concept, and maybe even the phrase, of separation of church and state. Roger Williams conceived of the idea of a beautiful garden in which there was a government on one side, which is what had its own unique beauty, and there was religion on the other side of the wall that had its unique beauty. And the wall was very important. Now, there's a professor, Stanley Lemons at Rhode Island College here, who's written extensively on the life and writings of Roger Williams. And he spoke to the Boston Humanists a few weeks ago at the 350th anniversary of the Constitution of Providence Plantations. It's very confusing why we have a state that is known as the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation. I read a book in the matter, and I came away knowing less after I read it before. But Professor Lemons said that there is no evidence that Jefferson or Madison ever read Williams's works. So the notion of separation seems to have been taken up by John Locke and spread through other enlightenment thinkers. And that is how separation of church and state came to be emerging United States of America. Well, I'm not going to tell again how I single-handedly slew multiple dragons back in 1956, 1963. It's amazing that Google pops up more than 500 references to my name. Even our cat thinks this is awesome, and she is not easily impressed. Well, maybe she worries a lot about dragons. The humans are very big with respect to a ground-dwelling cat that is 6 inches off the floor. And I don't need to be very profound to inspire this audience. I was profound once. If you Google Schempp gravity, you will find my essay on gravity, a spoof on creationists. There are several jokes embedded in it, but sadly a number of people didn't see them. But I think you might enjoy them. I suppose that I could have been a wasp. I grew up as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I grew up with a Unitarian family with the name Ellery. It is interesting what an unusual name can do for you. This was double in Philadelphia. Going to a Unitarian church was different enough, but not being named Ron was distinctly odd or suspect. Well, as John Gibbons said, I will tell you about our interdependence. I really did never achieve anything without the help of others. Obviously, there never would have been a Supreme Court case without the help of the ACLU, their wonderful attorney, and my parents. It's pretty remarkable what happened back in 1963. I don't think it could happen today. You know, the Supreme Court, out of the 9 members, members, 6 of them are Catholics. Well, 100 years ago, of course, it was 100% lost, that is, Southern Protestant and male, of course. But nonetheless, in the modern time, the court has become extremely imbalanced. Every 5-4 decision you have read about in recent years is 100% Catholic. That is to say, Thomas, Alito, Roberts, Scalia, and Kennedy are the 5 Catholic votes that we see repeatedly on the conservative side. I am worried about the direction of the Unitarian Universalist Association. I believe that it's moved steadfastly away from humanism. Let's look at the entire program here at this General Assembly. Humanism, of course, off to reform. Even at my church in Bedford, the word humanist became a dirty word in some circles. I know, John, this is a misunderstanding and apologetics and twisting and more apologetics. The fact remains that the words were a very humble, unwelcoming response. But this stuff about Rhode Island, or this stuff about the General Assembly and the Unitarians, is very interesting because the Unitarian Universalist that I was growing up with was very keen on promoting separation of church and state. But in all of these important, significant Supreme Court cases that have come up in the last 10 years, the UUA has not once submitted an amicus curiae brief, that is, an amicus brief, a Franklin Court brief, that would tend to support separation of church and state. That's not a very good recommendation for the congregation. Well, I don't want to get into much more. I do think that we need to think. I want to leave one important idea, that there's the growth of non-believers, and I've been cautioned not to say non-believer, that I should say non-theist, because we're all believers in something or other, and so non-believer is maybe the wrong word. It's not quite accurate, although I think we all know what it means. But non-theist says I don't believe in any supernatural entity that interferes in human affairs. But if we're going to support non-belief and reject theistic thinking for how the world works, I think that's very important that it incorporate a commitment to separation of church and state. It's one thing to have a personal belief that you don't need a God to understand what's happening in the world around us. You don't need God to think about God in terms of deciding on our social policies or political policies or whatever. And I think that's a perfectly good idea, and of course I always support it. But that is a sterile position unless it's coupled with an understanding that separation of church and state is important beyond a personal commitment to world outlook. Because separation of church and state involves social and political consequences and viewpoints that are essential to maintaining a society where atheists and humanists can flourish and feel safe and secure. So I very much emphasize, urge that from our atheist friends, our non-believer friends, and our humanist friends, secular humanists, that we make sure that separation of church and state is at the core of our commitments and support all of the organizations that are related to that. And finally, I want to say a few words, or one word, or maybe a few words about my wonderful partner, Arlene. Without Arlene, I could never have gotten here. I could never have achieved all the things that I have achieved in later part of my life. The support and encouragement that she has provided has been just absolutely fantastic. So I think some part of this award goes not only to what maybe I did 70 years ago, 50 years ago, but sure that we try to, the Tea Partiers say, we're going to take back our country. Well, they're not the person. But maybe we should say, let's take back our UU congregation, our UUA towards humanism and get away from some of this excess spirituality and churchy stuff, right? Thank you.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Ellery, or shall we break up for schmoozing, eating, and listening to the jazz duo? Oh, we got one question.
I have a question. Could you tell us the story of what happened in 56 with you and school and the Bible?
Well,
I'm from Abington.
you're from Abington, Pennsylvania? Oh. You look perfectly sane.
We're the same age. I went to school, but I was in Germantown at that time. We had to read the Bible.
Well, you probably know that in Pennsylvania there was a law that required that 10 verses of the Holy Bible be read at the beginning of each school day, each school classroom throughout the state of Pennsylvania. So it was a law. Although the Lord's Prayer was not part of the law, it was customary. And so every teacher had to had to have the Bible read at the beginning of each school day. Now, in the early grades, of course, the teacher read the Bible, but by junior high school, they gave it to the kids, to read in quotation. And didn't you do that? In your classroom, didn't you have people reading the Bible?
I don't quite.
I mean, if you don't want to admit to a heresy in the public, that's okay.
I don't remember personally reading the Bible, but I know we had the Bible read every single day.
Yeah, and the Lord's Prayer?
The Lord's Prayer and whatever else.
Well, quite a number of people have come up to me over the years and said how wonderful it was that this practice stopped. 2 years ago, so I was in Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg, and a man named Shannon Turk came up to me, embraced me, with tears in his eyes. He had moved to western Pennsylvania from someplace in the west, and was unfamiliar with his Bible reading practice. Bible reading took place in about 30 states in one form or another, sometimes local decision, but around 30 states. Shannon Turk had not been part of that, but he came there and he didn't know what to make of it, and so he didn't put away all his books to pay attention to the Bible reading as was required in my school. It did not stand for the Lord's Prayer, and the teacher called him forward and demanded that he bend over the desk, and he got paddled. Well, Shannon Turk was a pretty determined young man, and for the next 3 years, every day in his life in school, he was humiliated and brutalized by being paddled in front of the class. And he said to me, one day the paddling stopped. And as I said, he embraced me. Well, that's an example of how this kind of religious nonsense is brutalizing and humiliating and horrifying. And so we should be very glad that it stopped.
But what happened with you? I mean, did you
The
refuse?
homeroom teacher sent me to the principal. The principal was rather confused and thought that maybe I was in trouble, and he sent me to the guidance counselor, who inquired whether I was having trouble with my father, whether I was having trouble with authority, and I said, no. I think my father and I probably agree on this completely, and I was quite sure of his support. We merely had a disagreement about Bible reading. When I came home, of course, that night and reported the day's activities to my folks, It was my father who suggested that I write to the ACLU. Now, here was another way I was extremely lucky. I haven't grew up in a family where my father knew about the ACLU. Not everybody does. And I remember typing out with 2 fingers on my dad's typewriter a letter to the ACLU, which is in Steve Solomon's book. So I did learn, and not very much happened to me. I wasn't suspended, I wasn't exiled, whatever. I did learn some years later that when I applied to colleges, my high school principal wrote a letter of disrecommendation that he insisted upon including in every one of my college applications. And there was a very nice dean at Tufts, Dean Charlie Stearns, who, when I had to come and ask him because CBS News or something called me up to ask me to do an interview or something. So I asked the dean if there's anything he knew that I should know. And he said, well, he told me the story about how he got this letter in which the school principal said I was a rotten apple in the barrel and I would bring disrepute on the Tufts and cause other irreparable harm. Dean Stearns was extremely kind, and he said that they had never regretted admitting me.
Thank you.
We met, I had you speak at our church, First Church of Boston, Second Church of Boston, and I did have one interesting question which had kind of intrigued me. As you probably no doubt know, there was a judge in, I think, Alabama who insisted on getting a 3-ton reproduction of the 10 Commandments.
Judge Roy Moore, yes.
Yeah, in his court. Now, my thought is, I'm not a lawyer, but it seemed to me if it was going to, the courts have a primary, a best evidence rule. Now, if the best evidence rule applied, shouldn't it have been written in Hebrew? The second question I have is, if you had a court of law and you had a copy of the 10 Commandments along with a copy of the Code of Hammurabi and the Justinian's law reports and Blackstone's law and Blackstone's law commentary on the laws and perhaps part of Hammurabi's code and specifically other law things, I would have no objection to that if it is seen as part of the law as how the law originated, because that, after all, would show different legal things for different places. What do you think?
Well, I'm not very fond of codes that are written 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. I mean, I think the world has moved on quite a good bit, and I think we've learned a lot, and I think our ethical and moral ideas have expanded and enlarged. I don't think that, I really just don't think anything that people knew 2,000 years ago has any relevance today. I don't have any respect for the Bible or for the Quran or for the Bhagavad Gita. Sometimes there's nice poetic passages, but as a code for living, nonsense. I mean, nobody believes in Noah's flood. Nobody believes in. It was only almost 150 years ago. People believed that if you got sick, it was because God was displeased with you and sent you a plague or something or other. When we discovered that there was germs that actually cause disease, that was a transforming understanding in human life. And I do remember, I don't actually remember, I'm not quite that old. I know that priests and preachers got up and promulgated and pontificated against this understanding that it was germs that caused disease, because that was undermining God and God's punishment and heaven and hell and all that kind of stuff. I grew up at a time when rockets were just being popularized or something. Every kid loves rockets. But it did seem to me that it was worrisome that if we had heaven up there and all these rockets were going up, that it would probably be punching holes in them and scaring the hell out of angels. I mean, I worried about this for 1 or 2 days when I was 17. So, I just don't think these notions have any relevance today.
The other question I had dating myself, and I may have the wrong title. One of the books published about the year I was born in the previous millennium was Catholic Power and American Liberty, which dealt with the question of if a church runs a hospital, would there be a problem with people who would like to see treatments that are not available or not part of the specific religious beliefs? And it seems that is exactly what we have with the Harvey and lobby case right now.
Well, I'm extremely worried about this decision that's going to come out next Monday, and which I'm fearful that the court will rule that corporations have the right to religion or religious freedom or some other such nonsense, and will do a major undermining of the whole concept of establishment, the non-establishment clause in religion. It worries the difference out of me, and I think it's, well, I'd like to make one little point here. There's an organization, Association of Jewish Women, what is it mean? Anyhow, White Courts Matter. Type into Google White Courts Matter. They've run a program for the last year or so, talking about trying to educate people on why courts matter and why appointees and nominees to the federal district courts, to the appeals courts, and ultimately to the Supreme Court, why this is so enormously important. The decisions of the 11th Circuit in Washington, D.C., and are often considered bellwethers of what the Supreme Court will do, and members of that court often are appointed to the nominated for the Supreme Court. Courts matter enormously, and we have to be aware of this. We have to be aware of the whole process in which a state senator, well, the president, via these state senators normally, make nominations, and how these people get appointed and confirmed in the Senate to these important courts. So, why courts matter? I urge everybody to look it up on Google. They are doing a marvelous job. It's essential. We'll never supply. We'll never we'll never have our First Amendment or any other amendments, except the Second Amendment, guaranteed for us unless we have good judges, and they have to be a mixture of liberals. I'm embarrassed. We need to have progressive and liberal judges. That's it.